Let's pursue what we're doing. This is the course outline, and it's much like the musical score of a symphony. And even though I have written it, now I must conduct it. But this is a kind of a score where spontaneity and creativity are at least half of what this needs to deliver. And if I stuck to this as if it were a plan, it would obviate half of the significance of the material. The reason for this is that the mind naturally stops with itself. The mind is the ultimate integral in the universe. It is evolved to do that and does do that exceedingly well, and will naturally stop with itself. And where it particularly comes to a rest, not just a stop, but a complete rest, not a pause, but a period, is at the center of the mind. When the mind has established a complete circle, and the circle is a circle that is a cycle that has run itself complete, so that you have not only the entire ambit and periphery of the circle, but you're able to find the center. So when the mind becomes completed enough in its ability to integrate, it will naturally form a center point. And one then says of themselves, or someone who is like this, they are a centered individual. They really have their self centered. And part of that centeredness is that they have a direct referential alignment to their body and the actions that their body does, the rituals. And so the two objectivities of mind and body have an alignment where they share the same center, the same point, and that you get a kind of a target-like quality to it, where the center is the bullseye. The mind circle is the next circle. The largest circle would be then the ambit of your action. And in between that circle and the mind circle is a number of subsidiary circles that are the cycles that are now completed and fulfilled of your experience, of your feeling, of your images, of your language, so that one becomes then this kind of target of circles and cycles within each other, and this then becomes, indeed is, an individual who is completely fulfilled and who is able to see the universe in that way, so that they are micro-universe in themselves. And the mind considers naturally itself then to be completed, a mature individual. Now, part of the iconography of this completeness for several thousand years was exactly that kind of an image, and the image is that of the universe, and this is an image of the universe finely distilled and brought symbolically together by an Alexandrian genius named Ptolemy, about 1800 years ago. And the Ptolemaic universe had as its ideal the completed man who was then a miniature universe in himself, man as a microcosm. And this kind of individuality was the ideal from late antiquity until the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, this was radically changed in the space of just a few years. Now, this card is one of the original tarot cards. Before the tarot deck was given the iconography of modern tarot decks, the tarot deck did not have 78 cards, it had 50 cards. And this particular tarot deck was reproduced from a very rare tarot deck from the Renaissance, the I Tarocchi del Mantegna, Andrea Mantegna, one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance, and he drew this Tarocchi deck in 1465. And it was almost impossible to find until it was reprinted in 1981 in Italy, and an edition of 500 copies. And because I was at the time teaching at the Philosophic Research Society with Manly P. Hall and a number of other people, we immediately wrote to Italy and were able to get 5 sets out of the 500 sent to the United States. And this is one of them. What is interesting is that the sets of the tarot deck of the Renaissance are a radical recalibration of the Ptolemaic universe, of the Ptolemaic symbol of the individual. And two things immediately leapt out from this: that the medieval world had been seriously wrong, and that the late classical world was the origin of the errors, and that the errors were due to a complete scrambling of an ancient wisdom tradition early in the 2nd century AD. And what was scrambled there was such that two major aspects beyond the individual, which are extremely important, not just to the universe, but to a larger reality than the universe called the cosmos, and that the cosmos has two kinds of form that do not occur within the natural cycle. They occur as transforms beyond the natural cycle, outside of the target. And those two kinds of forms are the arts and the sciences. And so, all of a sudden, distinct from the medieval, late antiquity schools where everyone was given subjects that were arranged in instructional levels that were specific in terms of their developments, and you were considered learned when you were able to repeat by rote what you had been instructed in the various subjects on the various levels, and you had completed it, and your individuality was recognizable, identifiable, and you fit in with others of the same ilk, and all of you were comfortable by a society ruled by measured habits that fit perfectly the referential alignment with this individuality. All of a sudden, within the space of just a little more than a decade in northern Italy, all of this was controverted. Now, the reason for this is that many large currents of events suddenly come to a penetration of a threshold after many hundreds of years of preparation, sometimes after more than 1,000 years of preparation. But as one would say, the day comes when on that particular day, the old illusions are penetrated. What built in northern Italy was that from the fall of the Byzantine Empire finally in the city of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, was definitely seen to be teetering on the brink of conquest and oblivion. In fact, Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed II, had been besieging the great walls of Byzantium for several years until in 1453, on one day, the city finally fell because breaches in these three great sets of city walls, 40 feet high and 20 feet thick, and had been unbreached since they were built by Constantine in the 300s AD and fortified throughout the whole Byzantine Empire of some more than 1,000 years. Just before it fell, about 15 years before it fell, many of the most learned scholars of Byzantium took their most precious books and fled, and where they fled to was the city of Venice, because Venice in northern Italy at the time, at the head of the Adriatic Sea, was the easiest port that was major and strong enough. The Venetian city-state was very strong in itself and in also naval affairs, so that their ships could go all the way down the Adriatic, up the Aegean, and bring these exiles all the way from the Black Sea, from the Sea of Marmara, from the Golden Horn, and safely convey them to Venice. When they arrived in Venice in the late 1430s, it was evident that they were carrying material that no one in the West had seen for maybe 1,200 years or more. And one of the things that they brought with them was a complete collection of Plato, all of his dialogues. During the medieval period, there were just a few Platonic dialogues, and they were in highly corrupted forms. And all of a sudden, they realized that we're not dealing here just with a handful of dialogues, but we're dealing with dozens of dialogues that are enormously sophisticated, and that they go way beyond and much earlier than Aristotle, who was like the cult figure of not only the medieval world, but of medieval science and of medieval understanding of art. So all of a sudden, you had the evidence in front of you in some rare tomes, and very wealthy northern Italian men, largely bankers, largely not from Venice, but from Florence, bought these books, and instead of having a conclave of all religions and all sects of Christianity in Venice, one of the exiles, temporary exiles from Florence, young Cosimo de' Medici, had the conference moved to Florence. And the Medici family themselves, under the aegis of Cosimo, became the number one patrons of this new learning. And Cosimo, one of the most wealthy men of the day, the de' Medici family had banking concerns all through Europe. France, Germany, even into England, northern Italy, Spain, everywhere. And he got wind, after about 10 years of raising a translator, he chose the young son of his personal physician, Marsilio Ficino, to be trained to read Greek well enough to translate this great treasure trove of Plato and many other books. A very esoteric volume came to him, known generally as the Hermetica. These are the treatises of Hermes Trismegistus. And when one went to Hermes Trismegistus, one found that the Ptolemaic universe was a mask of regression that had no bearing whatsoever on the true nature, not of just the universe. The universe can wear this mask in someone's mind, and it matches their individuality, self-identification, and it matches a kind of constricted action society where you follow the rules and the codes and the referentialities, and then everything is complete, is it not? All of a sudden, the combination, the 1-2 punch of the whole Platonic corpus and the Hermetica as like a smaller inside showed that there was complete transformation in all of this. So Ficino was taken off the project to translate Plato temporarily because Cosmo was getting old and he wanted to have the Hermetica translated completely before he died and had it read to him. And so Ficino did this. And from 1453 on until about 1464 when Cosmo died, Ficino brought the ancient Hermetic wisdom, creme de la creme, of not just the classic world, but going all the way back to ancient Egypt, going all the way back to the ancient Near East, going all the way back to ancient Iran, ancient India, all of the components of the Hermetica that reached an apex around 90 AD, 110, 120 AD in Alexandria, were all translated into a language that people could read. Cosmo died in 1464, and it was right on his deathbed that people who understood what he had done commissioned Andrea Mantegna to do this tarot deck, so that the 50th card, which is the Ptolemaic universe, is prepared by a series of 49 cards leading up to it, so that one has this not as the conclusion, but one sees this not as the final word on the universe, but the last word in an illusion which you can now dispel and you can transcend and go beyond. And from 1465, from the 1460s, when you look at the Italian Renaissance achievements in the arts and sciences, it's like an explosion. It's like all of a sudden a new kind of human being, men and women, who are not content to be just individuals, but who want to open up their capacities to go beyond the target individuality of codes and cultures and limited symbols into the transforming symbols of consciousness. And so one has not just some brilliant person who becomes a visionary, but you have a culture which now becomes a visionary population of men and women who very quickly come to understand that civilization is a completely different form from culture. Culture is always an integral process that is sandwiched in between integral ritual actions and an integral symbolic thought, so that in between ideas and what you do is the process of culture, which is integral. But the process of civilization is differential, not integral at all. And it is not sandwiched in between the body and the mind. Civilization is a differential process, not an integral one, and its place is in between the resonances of a differential person and a differential cosmos. So now you have a completely different quality that has come into play. And in Mantegna's tarot deck, you find it very clearly. There are 2 cards before this that culminate a whole series, 5 sets of 10, 5 tens. Not just a perfect 10, but that the 10 was it was not only before Aristotle, it was before Plato, it went back to Pythagoras. And for Pythagoras, 10 was a special sacred number, which was not written with the Arabic 1 and 0. It can be written that way and is esoteric as well. Because when 10 is written 1 and 0, you now have an index of a limited set of symbols that can transform indefinitely. Not only do you have a set of 9, but you add a 0 to it, and it jumps out of not just registering as a cardinal sequence further, 10 is 1 more than 9, but 10 is also an ordinal power of 1. And every time you add a 0, after the 1 and the 0 and the 0, you begin having an ordinal jump, so that one can now not only count cardinally, but in terms of orders. And that the orders will hold their ordering, but the ordering is not on the basis of sequential cardinality, that is in a ritual step comportment, but it is jumping by orders, and one has to keep track of this in a new kind of a way. But even deeper than that, if you count from 1 to 9 in any kind of a sequence, and then you have a 10 like the Roman numeral X, you have jumped out of the sequence that was at one time in an order, an ordinality that was one transform away from cardinality, but now you have gone into a second transform, which is a distillation. Because it means that the first 10 are a set, and you can have a number of different sets, and in terms of the Tarocchi del Mantegna, you have 5 sets of 10. And the first set of 10 are the conditions and ranks of man. The second 10 are Apollo and the 9 muses. And the third is the liberal arts and sciences. And the fourth, cosmic principles. And the fifth, firmaments of the universe and their spheres. Not only are they just circles, but they are spheres now. So one lifts this off the page, and the sphericality transforms by different orders, so that the further one goes out, each sphere now is not just in a sequence of going out, but is in spheres that keep transforming. And the 9 cards in the 10th group that end with the mask of the universe, the first card in that 10 is the moon. The second card is Mercury. The third, Venus. The fourth, the sun. The fifth, Mars. The sixth, Jupiter. The seventh, Saturn. So now you have the heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon, and the 5 planets going out in this kind of an order. And you notice here that what is happening is that when you have 7, when you have the 5 planets and the sun and the moon, what remains by far as like 99.99% of the visible cosmos, not just universe, but cosmos, is all the stars. So that after the 7 planets, one has a angelic figure holding up a sphere with all the stars. And the very next card is a dancing angel who holds up a sphere which is completely empty, completely open. And I was fortunate years ago to get a larger version of those. This is the Hermetic Transform, that the entire universe will have its fullness in nature, but will be able to transform not once but twice out of its whole ordinal sets into something else. And that this is the interval of punctuation that allows for this to happen. Now, we've seen this operating in the way in which life actually divides on the cellular level. And we've talked about this the last 2 weeks. There are 5 phases that happen in every cell for it to divide itself into two, from one into a pair. And in this dividing into a pair, there is a possibility for the genetic information that has gone through the RNA onto the ribosome to make the proteins to help then unfold what these cells are going to aim at, not just the stem cells, but the whole way in which cellular division happens. There are 5 stages, and we've talked about them. The pro-phase, the pro-metaphase, in the center the metaphase, then the anaphase, and then the telophase. And we talked about a little mnemonic, pro, meta, and tel. It is in the center, the metaphase, that the cell itself undergoes a completely hermetic transformation. It's temporary, but it is absolutely essential for this to happen. The cell, in most living organisms, has a nucleus. It has a center. On the middle, on the 3rd phase, on the metaphase, in cellular change, the center, the nucleus, temporarily disappears, and in its place, what occurs is called a spindle. And the spindle is actually a pivot. And what the pivot does is it generates in the cell a different arrangement of its structure from a natural, centered structure into a pivotal structure that has a magnetic quality. And this magnetic quality turns the cell by the spindle axis into a little miniature magnetic field, which has a north and south pole, and the chromosomes that have paired up, the 2 chromosomes, one from the mother and one from the father, that have now paired so that you have 2 sets of mother and father chromosomes, they have gone in the pro-metaphase to an equilibrium around the equator of this magnetic field. And while they're doing that, they also shorten and fatten. It's like getting really nutritive. Then in the metaphase, they migrate to the poles of this field. And that allows then for the cell to have 2 replicas of the same chromosomal information, and the cell is able to divide. It's not that the nucleus divides at all, it's temporarily not there. It is temporarily missing, not in action, but missing because of its transformation. And then the wonderful thing that happens, the cell, as it pulls itself apart, shifts back from the magnetic spindle to having 2 centers that reappear. And now you have 2 cells that have nucleuses. This is an ancient wisdom. This is the way in which one has to be able to understand the arts and sciences in order to understand that nature does not stop with completion, but reaches out for a different quality called perfection. And that the cycle of completion is complemented by an ecology of making something perfect. But the perfectness is not an integral quality, it is a differential quality, which means its perfection lies in its infinity and in its eternity. So that now you have not only a cycle of integral nature, but you have an ecology of differential consciousness that increasingly becomes resonant in new harmonic sets that register the two transforms. The first transform is into what we would call, colloquially, the spiritual person, the artist of their own conscious person, who is so much more capacious than just the symbolic center of someone's idea of themselves or someone's idea of their identity with their body. The person now can indeed complement and understand the alignment of body and mind, but the person also has a yearning resonance further on, beyond, not only beyond the body and beyond the mind, but because of its own nature, it has a resonance with the cosmos. So that the cosmos becomes a differential form, just like the art of the spiritual person is a differential form. And they relate not by alignment, but by an increasing possibility of indefinite, infinite resonances that nevertheless carry with them all the time a harmonic, which can be recognized. You can realize the center of the mind, but there's no end to the possibilities of the conscious ecology, of the art of the person, and the science of the cosmos. They are both capable of infinite possibilities and refinement, so that one doesn't look for completion, but for the harmonic that carries the chord of the perfection. And so wherever you go, after that, after having established that double transform, you are able now to recognize it wherever you run across it, anywhere, in yourself, in others, in the cosmos. And one begins to understand that there is a situation where literally one is returned back to primordiality, the phrase in the book of Job, when all the stars sang together, the music of the spheres, a Pythagorean term. The two transforms are, the first is to develop conscious vision as a differential field, and the second to develop historical consciousness as a further differential field. Art comes out of the magic of vision, and science comes out of the sophistication of historical consciousness. The difficulty is that both art and science, when just conceived by mental ideas, by the mind, are reduced down to masks of themselves. And art will become then an adjunct of culture, not a springboard for civilization at all. It'll just become pop culture or traditional culture. Everything now will be good or bad art on the basis of, is it new for fads, or is it traditional and that everyone knows this? And so increasingly, what gets left out, sifted out from art, is the new, the spectacular, the fresh, the refinement. But it happens even more so in science. And science is curtailed and pulled back and left into a very interesting situation. It first is brought back into the mind so that it is just now a symbolic structure, and instead of it being a differential that is able to generate infinity and eternity in a real analytic, it becomes reduced now to a game. And so what happens is that the mind, withdrawing science out of its differential mode and putting it back into a mental idea, it then becomes the basis of dogma and indoctrination and ideology. And then it regresses further back into the body, and it becomes lodged into just ritual activity. One of the most poignant phrases I ever heard of was Carl Jung one time told someone, he said, science is 90% meal talk. If you go where science is being done, they're just ordinary people going through the motions and rituals of the bench, of the laboratory, of the experiments, and everywhere in the world today you find articles on the fact that people have lied about their research. They didn't do any research at all. They jimmied the experiments so that the results came out that were expected, and now you can get grants again because, look, you have these results. We wanted to get these results, and we have them. Many famous cases now in the world. Always has been that way. For more than 1,200 years in the medieval world, it was always that way everywhere, all the time. That's why nothing got very far. We are quickly becoming medieval again in the early 21st century because of a complete lack of understanding of the double transforms that were apparent at many times on this planet, and not just in the West, in Asia as well, India, China, Iran, Egypt, many, many, many times. And each time there was a burst of civilization that respected the various cultures that were like the tapestry of the experience of people until they were able to get transformed enough to become larger persons than just members of some kind of a tribe or some kind of a nation or some kind of a tradition. Yes, one still has that, and one is glad to have that. It's wonderful, but it's also wondrous to be able to have that larger renaissance where the art of your own person becomes viable, where the resonances of your person now look out and see not a hostile, threatening universe of possible transgressions against codes and laws and principles and dogmas and ideologies for which you can be punished. But now it is a challenge to explore the adventures of consciousness, the adventures of learning, the possibilities also not of just individuals transforming, but of whole communities, whole populations of people who have all transformed so that now you have world communities. And if one takes a look at a publication like Nature, the international magazine of science, it has about 700,000 subscribers, and I think 3-point-something people read it, so you have a world community of several million people who share an art and science of the ecology of exploring really on a major level. And out of this, of course, has come progressively a refinement in the last 20 years, the last generation. We have refined so that we can look at time analytically down to the femtosecond. And on the level of the femtosecond, work was done by an Arab professor at Caltech. And on the femtosecond level, you can see molecular action. And then on the next level down, the attosecond, you can see atomic action. And very soon, we're going to be able to go to the subatomic level of time to see that in action. So that one's analytic now becomes refined enough to see right to the edges of where existentiality emerge, and what is occurrent constantly on every chord, on every level, is that existence on every level doesn't just emerge once, it emerges vibratorially, resonantly, iteratively. So literally, not only is the universe alive, it's alive and very fertile. Let's take a break. Let's come back to some of the magic of science, the magic of art, and the even deeper magic of science. One of the effects of the Renaissance rediscovery of the ancient Hermetic wisdom, its Pythagorean base, its Platonic expansion, and the whole tradition from that. Once that had been brought back into play, there was a quality of differential consciousness that had not been seen in a broad population of people in Europe since the 300s AD. It's about almost 1,200 years. So they became a community of people that after several generations developed an ability to refine generation by generation, so that you had at the end of the 1500s one of the most refined populations of people ever to live on the planet. 3 of those individuals characterize almost the pinnacle of human capacity at conscious perfection into the infinities and eternities. One of them is Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote and a number of other works. The second is William Shakespeare. And the third is Johannes Kepler. Now we know this in Shakespeare. Let me tell you something of the excellence of Kepler, and then we'll move on, because this is an important thing. Kepler was the first person to be able to look at an accumulation of observational data made by the great Tycho Brahe, who was a Danish man, a flamboyant. He had lost the tip of his nose in a sword fight and had a metal nose. And he had talked the king of Denmark into giving him a whole island as a scientific community where he could have just all the instruments he wanted and needed and all the time to use them to observe the heavens so that they could make accurate horoscopes. And he made these great observing cradles where he would position himself and lay in them, and he would measure the exact positions of planets and the exact confirmations of the constellations of the stars. But he was not a very good mathematician, and so he hired the young Johannes Kepler to do the math for him. And when Kepler was doing the math of all the patient observations of the planet Mars, he discovered that Mars in no way moved in a circular orbit, that the target cosmos, or the target universe, to be more precise, of both Ptolemy and of Copernicus were in serious error, because there was evidently an elliptical shape indicated by the observations and by the math. and that the math was completely new. He was the first one to ever do this. And the reason he could do this is that there was a great mathematician, an English mathematician before him, just the generation before him, who had worked out the mathematics of how to navigate on the globe. His name was John Dee. He was the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, and he was the great magus of the day. But before he was a magician, a court magician of huge import, he was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 1500s. He figured out by 1575 how you can navigate the oceans on a globe when you're out of sight of land for months at a time, by using the navigation of stars and star positions and planet motions, so that he perfected the ability to refine things like the old medieval instruments that now became more scientific instruments than just the medieval instruments. And all of a sudden, instead of like the astrolabe, you began to have the sextant and the compass, and a math that was able to work with this. And Kepler took that math and Tycho Brahe's observations and developed the first celestial mechanics that was realistic. Because what the arts and sciences do is they generate increasingly reality. Not an integral, but reality. And one of the odd things that came out of it was the realization that there was no center to the star system at all. Not only was the Earth not the center, the sun was not the center either. That the center, for the first time, was seen to be a locus in pure space. It's called a barycenter, B-A-R-Y. And that it is the complementary gravity and orbital mechanics of the sun and the planets as they mutually go around in what would have been a circular, perfect order in nature, but is actually an elliptical order, and it takes consciousness beyond the natural assumptions, beyond the natural confirmed laws of mental ideas and ideologies, and enforced ritual rules that everyone has recognized for more than 1,000 years, to completely penetrate through that and realize that all of this had been a veil of appearance only. Not just an illusion, but a veil of appearance that promoted something more insidious than an illusion. It promoted a delusion. An illusion is something that you're convinced that you see in the appearances, but a delusion is a deepening self-justification of believing not only in it, but believing everything that you derive from that. And so one comes into an indefinite retrograde, and what happens in a retrograde is enormously mysterious and important. We come to this little booklet on Barbara McClintock's scientific legacy, Jumping Genes. And one of the interesting women who carried on much of her work, Maxine Singer. And one of the things that she worked on was to find how transposons that Barbara McClintock had found in the 10 chromosomes of corn, Indian maize, and also that it applied to an insect population, Drosophila, flies, also must apply to mammals, and she worked with monkeys. And what she found was something that was extraordinarily scientific and refined, and extraordinarily confirming of ancient wisdom. Just a couple of lines just to cue you in so that you get the gist of this. She's working here with two kinds of interspersed sequences, short interspersed sequences, SINES, signs, about 300 nucleotides in length, previously discovered by others, and long interspersed sequences called lines, LINES, signs and lines, up to 6,000 nucleotides long. At the time, transposable elements had not yet been discovered in mammals. However, Singer suspected that monkey lines, the long sequences, might just be transposable. For instance, they appeared to contain a gene that looked a lot like a gene that makes reverse transcriptase. Reverse transcriptase is an enzyme that allows DNA to be reverse synthesized from RNA. It enables a class of transposable elements called retrotransposons to transpose. However, unlike other transposable elements, such as those in maize and fruit flies described earlier in this essay, retrotransposons don't actually move when they transpose. What moves is a copy synthesized from the retrotransposon's RNA transcript. So that what you get is not anything actual. What you get is a copy, and out of this copy came the age-old faulty belief that, for instance, art is an imitation of life. And all of Aristotle's aesthetic is based on art as imitation. Because they were working, he was working, almost everyone for several thousand years worked with a mental idea that used as its basis a retro copy and not the actual creative actuality of art. Now, the only persons that would know this are people who are artistic, who make the art not only out of themselves, but make it out of the true origin of art, which is in the vision of it. If you don't have a creative vision, you're not going to go very far making art. And if you don't have creative vision that can be refined to an analytic, like a theory, you're not going to have very real science at all. So that the origin of art is in the creative imagination of visionary consciousness, and when it is double refined, double transformed, you get a distillation of it. The first is a fermentation transformation, water into wine. The second is a distillation of the wine into cognac. Science is a distillation further from the wine of art. And the way that it distills it is through historical consciousness. Now, if you're not able to have creative vision, you won't have art, but you also won't have the theoretical capacity that can be further transformed and refined into the historical consciousness that allows for an analytic form to come forth. And when the analytic forms come forth, they're like art forms. They have a very particular, noticeable tone. Those forms in reality are feminine in tone. So that differential creative forms are remarkably feminine in their tone, which is a complete difference from the way in which things work in nature. Nature is always feminine. Mother Nature. She's the mother of all that there is. And culture is always like the daughter of that mother is feminine as well. But one would call, and the name was applied to 10,000 years of women who were fantastically great at sustaining and rooting the culture, the whole Neolithic era of mankind, about 12,000 years. Corn mothers. Mother Nature and the Corn Mother. The return of the vegetation, Demeter and Persephone, Kare. So that nature and culture as processes in the natural integral are feminine, but the forms that come out are masculine in tone. Whereas in consciousness, the processes are masculine, but the forms are feminine. And so you get a very interesting do-si-do, which forms a very creative kind of complementarity. But the complementarity, if it is not recognized by a full maturation of going through both the cycle and the ecology together, so that you get how they dance together, one does not understand the difference between reality and a copy of something that comes from a different order, a different mode. If you use imitation criteria, art becomes intellectually what it was for several thousand years, a mimesis, a mimetic form. Art forms are good when they are mimetic of natural existential things. This apple that you drew should look like that apple out there. If you hold that criteria, a Cezanne apple might not be worth very much. But it becomes attenuated when you come especially to self-portraiture. When you look at the achievement, for instance, of Egyptian sculpture, you find that almost 5,000 years ago, Egyptian sculpture is very lifelike. You can see the personality of a pharaoh from the third dynasty very easily in the sculpture. It's really fantastic work. But that's not just the only criteria, because self-portraiture, especially in the last 100 years, has undergone transforms that show us that self-portraiture now is on a scale maybe several thousand times more expanded than it has ever been before in human history. Is extraordinary. And not only self-portraiture, but anything that the artist does is a resonance of their self-portraiture. One of the greatest women artists of the 20th century was named Pitsialak. It means seagull in Eskimo, in Inuit. And she lived on Baffin Island in the Arctic Ocean. And she didn't produce any art till she was in her mid-50s. And then for the last 30 years of her life, she produced about 7,000 drawings and almost 300 Eskimo prints, and each one of them is a Pitsialak. Each one of them is like a Picasso or like a Van Gogh. One gets to see the personal style of Pitsialak in every work, and you realize that each work is a self-portrait, but in an expanded, differential, conscious way. And that ability to refine, to see that, gives you then a sense also of the historical development, the themes that she worked with. And that historical consciousness added to the artistic person gives one, for the first time, an ability to develop a poignant analytic that leads very easily into science. That one can now have a science that develops the art analytically and adds to the creativity. A case in point was that about 25 years ago, for the very first time, a French female paleontologist named Arlene Leroy-Guérin was interested in Lascaux, and not just in the paintings of Lascaux, but in the scientific content of the pigments used in Lascaux about 20,000 years ago. And so she had it, for the first time, submitted to a very meticulous scientific analysis, a chemical analysis, which showed remarkably that they were not just pigments picked up from the rocks and applied then to the walls, but each one had a very complicated recipe that took several transformations to have exactly that color. The black was not just manganese oxide, but contained a little bit of white clay so that the carrier of that was going to apply the pigment to the rock would stay and hold it there. It was like a pre-glue that one would prepare a canvas before you paint by putting your gesso on so that it would accept not the canvas, but the gessoed canvas accepts the paints, which are made together in a formula so that you get exactly not only the right color and tone, but you get something that lasts. In Lascaux's case, it has lasted 20,000 years. And each color had its own complicated recipe so that they understood not chemical analysis, but they understood exactly the proportions of what to do, how, and when to get exactly the red or the black or the white, and to make sure that in the application of it, that when it was applied, all of this would work together. Science has a peculiar way, but it takes a spirit of artistic adventure to awaken art out of vision, and it takes a deeper commitment to awaken science out of the historical consciousness that comes from being artistic for a long time, being visionary for a long time with a population of people together. Science depends very much on the richness of the community that is exploring together, whereas the artist tends to be not an individual, but initially an artist in their own cosmos, their own resonance to the cosmos, whereas science more and more is carried in a transform from the individual genius to a whole community of people. And we took, at the beginning of science, the greatest scientific creative genius of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. And we're going to come to another pair of scientists, and the greatest scientific artistic genius of the second half of the 20th century was Richard Feynman. And we're going to take his QED, quantum electrodynamics, but we're going to talk about Richard Feynman, who, born in Brooklyn, in New York, grew up as an ordinary kind of a street kid who really was interested in everything, but was interested and could do the math, but could also theorize and visionize beyond the math, so that finally the math no longer worked for him as refined as it was, so he made up his own mathematical notation, created it from scratch, his own mathematical language, Feynman diagrams. And they are used today because they're the best, clearest analytic expression of relationalities that are so complex that ordinary math notation, no matter how developed it is, and very developed it is indeed, would not be able to carry and convey the scientific resonance of all of it, whereas Feynman diagrams do. And we're going to pair with Feynman a pair of British characters. One of them is Stephen Hawking, and his great teacher, Roger Penrose. Penrose has just finished a 1,100-page book called The Road to Reality, A Complete Guide to the Laws of the Universe. Just finished and published and put out so that the entire world is reading Roger Penrose's The Road to Reality. Penrose was originally famous in the 1960s for a math process called the Penrose Transform. Very complex, and we'll do the best that we can to try and convey that to you. What's interesting here is that the link between the generation of Einstein and Feynman came in the 1930s, especially the late 1930s and the early 1940s. And the link at that time was not so much in the science, because the science that was really on the avant-garde was secret. Not just because of World War II, but leading up to it. And the art at the time had been avant-garde a generation before. What is there from, say, 1936 to roughly 1946, in that 10 years, what is artistically and scientifically created is science fiction. And you find science fiction of the time enormously attentive to the adventure, the far-out adventures of science fiction. And you find covers like Thrilling Wonder Stories. This is December 1937, but it features an article by Rockets by Willy Ley. Willy Ley was one of the people who worked with Wernher von Braun on the early rockets, Herbert Oberth in Germany, and left because he didn't care much for the Nazis, and began writing not so much in scientific journals, but initially in scientific articles in science fiction magazines. The next issue, February 1938, it has all these science fiction stories, and it has Giant and Dwarf Stars by Sir James Jeans. Then in the very next month, April 1938, with all these science fiction stories, including Hollywood on the Moon by Henry Kuttner, you have the great Sir Arthur Eddington on eclipses of the sun. So you begin to find a pattern. Adventure stories that are not just adventure stories, they're excursions into vision that develops a sense of far-out art, the far-out stories, the far-out illustrations, that goes further into a historical transform, that it isn't the past that's so important or the present, but it is the future. And so you find one of the great geniuses of science fiction at the time, just starting out, Robert Heinlein. Most of his early stories are all collected in a future history series, The Past Through Tomorrow. So that what you get here is a complete complementarity do-si-do. Instead of history being about the past as it is in the natural integral, historical consciousness is largely about the future. That will be, if you do the adventure with creativity and refinement enough to get down to the analytic and be able to explore it both ways in a resonance. Not an alignment, but in a resonance. So that the forms of consciousness move by feminine harmonics, whereas the forms of nature move by masculine integrals. They're different, but they go together. And when they are together, you get a wholeness which is not achievable either by completeness or by perfection into infinity. You get the actuality that is vibrant and fertile. We've been taking Nancy Kress, Beggars in Spain, because she is the inheritor of a great theme in science fiction that developed from the late 1930s all the way to when she published this in the early 1990s. The theme is this: if it were possible for a human being to mutate in such a way that they became a superhuman, they would, in the history of science fiction, taking off from Frankenstein, be feared and be killed and be suspicious and be hunted, so that most of their creativity would go into being elusive and not be discovered, not caught. One of the earliest science fiction classics on that theme is by a man named Olaf Stapleton in England, 1935. Odd John, a mutant who has an IQ of 2 million and who founds a utopian community on a South Seas island so they can get away and live, and then they are pursued and discovered, and instead of wreaking havoc on human beings, very easy to do, they decide to do away with themselves and not go into this confrontation. But the greatest of all of the superhuman mutant stories is by A.E. Van Vogt, and it's called Slan. It was originally published in October 1940 in a magazine called Astounding Science Fiction. It's about a little boy named Jami Cross who's running with his mother, and their tendrils are covered in their hair so they don't really show too much, and the mother is killed by the pursuers, and the young 9-year-old boy is scooped up and raised by an old gypsy woman named Granny, rather cruel, and who wants to parade him in carnivals and circuses and make money off him. And he all the time is maturing and growing up and beginning to understand that there are other Slans. There are many editions of Slan. And as he discovers that there are other Slans, he discovers that he is the mastermind of all the Slans, and that individually he learns to, this is October 1940, to make atomic power, to make spaceships that can leave the Earth, and he decides that instead of sticking around to be persecuted or to give up to the rest, that he will leave the planet with his coterie of people, his Slans, and they will go into freedom to go out into the cosmos and find it there. You can see that the themes are not only enormous, but that they develop so rapidly that it's hard to believe. We use the double helix in nature, and this is the annotated critical edition with all the extra things that were here, but when it was first published in 1958, it was published in a little paperback that was maybe 140 pages. The third edition of his Molecular Biology of the Cell is over 1,000 pages and enormously analytical of every conceivable process, and this edition is out of date because it's gone about twice as far as this, even in just the handful of years that this has been published. The new encyclopedia of the biological sciences is 20 volumes, and it's very fast running out of date because the 21st century is really coming on now. By 2010, we'll have the ability to go to subatomic processes and analytically characterize them. And at that point, astronomy will have developed its ability to go with very large base composite telescopes and reach the end and edge of visibility. Because for there to be visibility, there has to be light, and for light, there has to be space in between things so that the photons have a chance to radiate out and create light. And it took about 300,000 years before the Bose-Einstein plasma concentrate of the original universe was expanded enough that there was able to be space in between not only particles, but in between atoms, which are like communities of particles, and in that open space for the first time, light shone in the universe. Before that, it wasn't that it was dark. It was that it was so kinetically hot, fast, intense, and dense that it was stronger than what light could possibly have been. Light is like a radiation of that, but is not that. So that one is going to look at, by about 2010, 2011, with the telescopes coming online by that time, is not a darkness, but a brightness so bright that it does not even register as light because it is all of a oneness. And by that time, hopefully, learning like this will have a population of people who will be able to see, not just in terms of perception or conception, but in terms of the art and science of conscious space-time, enough to be able to realize what it is that they're participating in. Not looking at something, but they're looking with original light. One of the translations of Zarathustra in ancient Avestic, his name in Greek, Zoroaster, meant stargazer. But Zarathustra in ancient Avestic, some 4,000 years ago, actually means ancient light. That wisdom is ancient light in the sense that it is more ancient than just old, but that the form of the cosmos being feminine, one has to look then for a very particular kind of relationship. One has to look for Mother Nature as an ancient feminine and the cosmos in its reality as a future feminine. And so the title of today's lecture is Ancient and Future Women. It's an ability to see the complementarity at the same time coming up in about 7 years. It is something all of us should live to see and to experience. It'll be a magical moment. Heinlein, in his Path Through Tomorrow, has the first prediction that there will be a hiatus before space travel will be taken up again of about 50 years, and that has happened. And he dates in his future history that the first mature civilization for mankind will be in place by 2172. And that one of the hallmarks of that is that interstellar travel will be available for the first time on a realistic basis by that time. And that we will not only have expanded beyond the planet and filled the star system, but be able for the first time to go off into the real deep waters, not of the universe so much, but of the cosmos, and go into the interstellar adventures. Next week, Feynman, Hawking, Penrose, and the adventure of the new space, the new time.